Queridos amigos, les habla la esposa del senador John F. Kennedy, candidato a la presidencia de los Estados Unidos. En estos tiempos de tanto peligro, cuando la paz mundial se ve amenazada por el comunismo, es necesario tener en la Casa Blanca un líder capaz de guiar nuestros destinos con una mano firme. Mi esposo siempre vigilará los intereses de todos los sectores de nuestra sociedad que necesitan la protección de un gobierno humanitario para el futuro de nuestros niños y para lograr un mundo donde exista la paz verdadera. Voten ustedes por el Partido Demócrata el día 8 de noviembre. Que viva Kennedy.
How many of you have seen that before? I wanted to start out with that because it's political history. And every time I see that, I can't help but think, 54 years ago, that was 1960, somebody in a room thought of the Mexican community. Because make no mistake, this is about the Mexican community. I mean, to be sure, there were, Cubanos and others here, but in such small numbers that essentially this was an appeal to the Mexican community. And somebody who made that decision realized what the future of the Mexican-American community could mean. Not just in that election, but also moving forward in the United States of America. And to be sure, it was about winning an election, but imagine what people must have thought at that point of John F. Kennedy's campaign. Geez, this guy's a goner. He's trying to appeal to people who are basically invisible in the United States, and he's trying to do it in a foreign language? What's he thinking? And yet, here we are, 54 years later, and it made me wonder, do we believe in our own power, in our own destiny, and will we try to control it? I mean, in later years after JFK took the presidency, we heard many stories about LBJ as president, and he had a very special relationship with the Mexican-American community, and a number of books have been written about that, but that's Texas, so it made sense. Much like, and you guys can boo and hiss about this comment, but I think it was real, the fact that George W. Bush was able to appeal to a Mexican community in Texas and be a successful governor. Again, it's based, we all have our opinion on that. But the man won 44% of the Latino vote across the United States because I think he had a better understanding. So here we are now in the year 2014, and we're talking about what if every Mexican voted. Now, of course, that's kind of pie in the sky, right, to think about whether every Mexican would vote based on our numbers. And a lot of what we've heard this evening is not exactly peaches and cream, and we're not where we should be. We know that. I've been in many rooms myself where, champagne corks are being popped over the fact that Latinos did, in fact, decide the presidential election in 2012 with their turnout, record numbers. But that makes sense because we do have the numbers. Our numbers continue to increase. And while we're excited about the 11.5 million that participated, make no mistake, 12 million didn't. And so where do we go from here? We've heard some wonderful stories this evening and suggestions about ways to engage the community. One of the things that stuck with me, and that's what happens when you're number 7 on the list for speaking. You get to think a lot more about what you're going to say, or alter course if as need be. I think Alba brought up a really good point about information. And by virtue of my previous role working for NALEO, it's an organization that does a lot of issues around civic participation and trying to persuade the Latino community to come out. There's another element of that, though, and I think it's very unfortunate that, and I'm going to use this term, don't get mad at me, Alba, I'm going to use the term mainstream media. I consider Telemundo and Univision mainstream, but I'm talking about the ABCs and the NBCs and the CBSs. that they don't do as much political, in my opinion, coverage as Univision and Telemundo, where they're really trying to educate our community and offer them, as you say, that information. And one of the things we always talked about was the key for our community to participate was, of course, information. But this second part of the formula, and there's a plus, so it's information plus, was something that I learned early on, but also just hit me more recently. I flew in or back to Chicago from a campaign in Phoenix, Arizona, where a young Mexicano, well, he's half Mexicano and half Colombiano, just ran for political office, 34 years old. When we talk about, also a former Chicagoan, Harvard graduate, you know, many of us have a similar story where we probably have no business being where we are, but we're all instilled the value of hard work. Anyway, long story short, he was able to win. He was not the chosen candidate. This is Phoenix, Arizona, and he was up against the powers that be, and yet he engaged the community. He invited them to participate. Many of the young people here tonight, it's very inspiring. He was able to do that. In fact, he had a group of, I understand you don't want to be called a dreamer, but for this purpose, he engaged a group of young people. And even though they could not vote, they were so excited to participate. And of course, what's going on in Arizona with SB 1070 and the past, and there's an energized electorate, the majority Mexican American in Arizona, and he was able to overcome. And the key was to invite the community to participate. Sounds like a very simple formula, and perhaps I'm oversimplifying, but it's information plus invitation equals participation. And I say the invitation part because although some of the stories we heard may be anecdotal, it still never ceased to amaze me that we knocked on doors and we talked to people. And the person that had been in that office prior to this campaign was there for 24 years. And while he did a wonderful job while he was in Congress, there was never a need to really reach out to our community, to build a bigger tent, so to speak. Let's build our electorate. Let's bring more people in. And so we're knocking on doors for people who had lived in this community for 2 decades. And they said, you know that you're the first person that has come and asked me to vote and talked to me about voting in 20 years. And I'm sure those are very, very similar stories here in the city of Chicago where, you know, we have issues, we have situations now where, for better or for worse, and again, we could get into, I know Dr. Andrade with his history, we could get into long-winded conversations about the value of majority minority districts where we're getting our folks elected. But you know, it's a very, very difficult thing when we're not having competition, we're not having this strong debate in the community about who should be elected and why and what are the key issues. And so for me, it was a very amazing time to see that formula actually work, that he was able to not only provide information to people, even at its most basic level. I mean, by show of hands, how many of you have actually worked on a political campaign? That's a lot of folks. That's well, that's why you're here tonight, I'm sure, as well. You know, the folks that usually are at these things are the most civically minded, civic-minded, and participating in their communities. That's very good. And so I think you understand the value of, and for those of you who didn't raise your hand, I would suggest that you try to get involved in a political campaign, even if it's talking to people on the phone, knocking on doors, whatever it is you can do, the value of understanding what's important to people. And there's so many other issues. We heard earlier today that you know, we're not one-trick ponies. We're not only about immigration reform. And so to have that value, to have that experience of what is it going to take to get people out, what matters to them, those are the things that we have to demand from our elected officials more. I mean, you heard that I'm, from Washington. I miss Chicago. It's the greatest city in the world. Go for the cheap applause. But Chicago does have a wonderful history of several successes. One of the things that came to mind as I was listening to some of the other speakers also, and particularly in the context of coalitions, is Harold Washington as the mayor of the city of Chicago. That doesn't happen unless there's a coalition of, as they called it, black and brown, but the Mexican-American community and the African-American community. And so we do need to see this. I would say that if there's a takeaway about how do we move our community forward, and eventually we're going to be able to do it on our own, but is there value in that? And I think there are all of these other coalitions that exist that we need to tap into. And so when you think about what would happen if every Mexican voted, would the government have shut down if every Mexican voted? Some of you may not be aware that basically it was 30 to 40 people that shut down the federal government. Why? There's no political payback. There's no Latinos. There's no Mexican Americans in these districts. Why? Because these folks were elected without our input, and they drew the political maps. So on and on and on. What if every Mexican voted? Would Geraldo Rivera still be on Fox News? I don't know. I've always wondered that. Probably not. Would Fox News exist? Actually, is really a question. No. For those of you who like Fox News, I apologize. So no, look, looking forward, I think that we have to look within ourselves. We can't do it alone as a Mexican-American community. It's a brave new world than it was 54 years ago. You know, when we talk about now, we're talking about Latinos and Hispanics, and so it's a bigger coalition, and folks that we have a sense of commonality with throughout the country, whether it's the Puerto Rican community or the Cubans. And folks, if we want to learn, whatever you think of the Cuban experience and Cuban exiles, look at the political power that the Cuban community has in the United States. And yes, some would argue, well, it pertains to Florida. 5% of the population holds a lot of issues hostage in Washington, D.C. And so I think there are places where we want to be. We can learn. We shouldn't be too proud to not learn from others. I know, some of the experiences we've had around voting rights issues and others have just been tremendous. And also, look, a lot of our leaders are stepping up. I don't know if you all are familiar with something called the Latino Victory Project. You may have read about it. I think there's been some level of ridicule, which has been unfair. Eva Longoria, the actress, I think people don't take her seriously, but she's very serious about moving the Mexican-American community forward and working with other Mexican-American leaders. Just before I came up, there was a quick discussion of money. And we all live in the real world, and money talks. And we know there's a lot of successful people, not only in this room, but across the United States, that we need to be engaging and saying, look, $25, $100, $500. They all seem to step up for President Obama. Unfortunately, all that didn't trickle down to many of the other races where we needed help. And so, even someone like George Lopez, I mean, again, people will laugh, oh, George Lopez. He was out there. He was taking the responsibility. He felt very strongly about his responsibility as having celebrity to be able to reach our community in a very unique way. And he truly believed that one day if we all worked together, that we could put a Latino in the White House. I mean, he'd be white with blue trim, right, and everything, but, the Latino would be there. So I thank you for listening.